Now, one of our fastest growing collections at the AAS is the Children's Literature Collection. At about 28,000 titles and growing, it ranges from the earliest catechisms printed for children and youth of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1650s through the juvenile novels penned by the likes of Louisa May Alcott and Mark Twain after the Civil War. We have one of the single largest collections of picture books and original illustration artwork produced by the late 19th century New York publisher McLaughlin Brothers, and for that reason, we collect American picture books through the year 1900. In my 32 years as curator and keeper of our children's collection, our children's books have been cataloged with access to a wide array of access points, including subjects like African American children, boys, girls, slavery, death, penmanship, literacy, money, and food. This level of in-depth cataloging has turned the Children's Literature Collection from a sparsely used resource into a go-to goldmine for researchers. Writing for and by children can be found also in the newspapers, in our newspapers and periodicals collection, which includes 350 children's magazine titles and 5,500 amateur newspaper titles, as well as in the children's sections of newspapers written for adults but for the entire community, like The Colored American. It is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Nazera Sadiq Wright, who has worked extensively with our children's books and papers, including The Colored American, to uncover the didactic stories that have been originally issued for a white audience, but were republished and repurposed in the African American press for consumption by children of color. Her work on the literary culture of Black girlhood is truly path-breaking. I was delighted to help Nazera when, as a Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellow, she chose to do her research at AAS. She had her pick of any place. She chose AAS to do her research when she was here in 2013 to 2014. During 2017 to 2018, she was also in residence at the Library Company of Philadelphia as a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow and as an Andrew W. Mellon Program in African American History Fellow to advance her second book on the influence of libraries on the literary careers of 18th and 19th century African American women writers. Dr. Wright holds a bachelor degree in English and African American Studies from the University of Virginia, a master's degree in English language and literature from Howard University, and a PhD from the University of Maryland at College Park, where she wrote her dissertation on girlhood in African American literature, 1827 to 1849, under the direction of Carla Peterson and Mary Helen Washington. She is currently an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Kentucky. Her book, Black Girlhood in the 19th Century, copies will be for sale afterwards, received the Children's Literature Association's Honor Book Award, recognizing an outstanding book of literary criticism in 2018. She contributed an essay on locating African American children's literature in the Children's Department of The Colored American to the book, Who Writes for Black Children? Great title. And that book just won the 2019 Children's Literature Association's Award for Best Edited Book. You are on a roll. Finally, she has created a digital humanities project entitled Digital Girls, Mapping Black Girlhood in the 19th Century. In a recent communication just today, Dr. Wright recalled, when I was a fellow at AAS, I would sit in the reading room for hours by day to complete research for my first book. In the evenings, I looked forward to listening to distinguished scholars giving lectures on their books. Now, I am the distinguished scholar who is giving the evening lecture on my book at the American Antiquarian Society. Dr. Wright will speak to us this evening on Black girlhood in the 19th century, in which she explores the often uncatalogued signatures and inscriptions written in 19th century Black girls' autograph albums to reveal the wide-ranging impact that early friendships, alliances, and associations had to Black girls' intellectual and political development. In Dr. Wright's words, my research connects disciplinary gaps in archival methods and African American literature. Indeed, Dr. Wright will show us how autograph albums provide what she calls unexpected places, unexpected spaces, that we cover buried histories of Black girlhood in the 19th century. Ladies and gentlemen, Nazera Wright.
Thank you, Laura, for that wonderful introduction. I am deeply honored to be here today to speak to you about my research. I am recovering from a lung condition, which is why I'm wearing my oxygen, which I usually do when I give long lectures. So 2 years ago, I wrote a book titled Black Girlhood in the 19th Century. My first book traces representations of Black girlhood in early African-American print and visual sources in the 19th and early 20th centuries, a span of time that ranges from the early decades of the New Republic to the eve of the Harlem Renaissance. Through extensive archival research, I uncover tropes of Black girlhood that provide an under-examined course for racial progress. The critical methods and theoretical concepts that I explored in Black girlhood in the 19th century led to my second book on early African-American women writers and their libraries. My second book explores the influence of libraries on the literary careers of 18th and 19th century African-American women writers. I consider how private and public libraries functioned as gateways to African-American women's literary authority, and I explore how Black women navigated these institutions that often rendered them invisible. I examine how the histories of Black women writers are often buried in literary forms less likely to be studied, such as autograph albums, or buried in archives due to underfunding, outdated finding aids, or minimally processed or non-digitized collections. To preserve their legacies, Black women writers are selecting specific repositories to house their papers while they are living. The second book will consist of 5 chapters. I begin with the influence and the significance of Carla Hayden as the 14th Librarian of Congress and the first woman and the first African American to lead the National Library. I then explore the 18th century poet Phyllis Wheatley's access to the private library of her neighbor, clergyman Mather Byles, to write her 1773 collection of poetry, poems on various subjects, religious and moral. Chapter 2 examines Harriet Jacobs' access to 3 libraries to write her slave narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. The garret, in which Jacobs hides for 7 years to evade capture during slavery, that I argue doubles as a private library. The anti-slavery reading room and circulating library that Harriet Jacobs and her brother opened for 9 months in Rochester, New York in 1848. And Harriet Jacobs' use of Nathaniel P. Willis's private library in his Idlewild estate in the Hudson River Valley to write her slave narrative as she cares for Willis's 5 children as a fugitive. In Chapter 3, I evaluate the significance of the haunted library plot in Julia C. Collins' post-Civil War novel, The Curse of Caste, or The Slave Bride, serialized in the Christian Recorder in 1865. Chapter 4 explores the often uncatalogued signatures and inscriptions in 19th century autograph albums, which reveal that Black girls were building alliances with Black women writers that would widen their networks and connect them to a Black elite. Chapter 5 examines Francis E.W. Harper's membership in Philadelphia's Mercantile Library, an institution designed primarily for the social climbing of white men, and Harper loaning her, quote, library ticket to other Black women writers such as Gertrude Bustill Moselle. I conclude by discussing the politics surrounding in which libraries Black women decide to leave their papers, as with Pulitzer Prize-winning poet and Chicagoan Gwendolyn Brooks' decision to archive some of her papers from 1940 to 1960 in UC Berkeley's Bancroft Library rather than in a Chicago-based institution. But today, I share research from my fourth chapter on 2 autograph albums that were owned by 2 Black girls, Miranda and Sallie Venning. I plan to discuss 3 important points. First, the practice of autograph collecting and the album's materiality. Second, how the Venning albums teach us about their family's history of sexual violence and exploitation while enslaved in Charleston, South Carolina. And third, I discuss how signatures and inscriptions in the albums reveal that the Venning girls were securing networks and living their lives in ways their mother and grandmother were unable to generations prior. So 2 years ago, I came across 2 autograph albums from the second half of the 19th century. The albums were owned by 2 Black girls who were sisters. Miranda Cogdell Venning, the oldest sister, was born in 1862. Her autograph album consists of signatures from 1877 to 1886. Sallie Sanders Venning was born 10 years later in 1872. Signatures in Sallie's album are written during 1886, the year she graduates from the 8th grade. The Venning sisters were raised in an elite African-American Philadelphian family in the 1880s. Their autograph albums are archived at the Library Company of Philadelphia in the Stevens Cogdell Sanders Venning collection. Materials in the collection date from 1734 to 1976 and consist of scrapbooks, newspaper clippings, photographs, and personal papers. Portions of this collection are digitized, but these 2 rare autograph albums are accessible only in material form. I was immediately drawn to these 2 attractive material objects, and many questions entered my mind. What were the lives of these 2 Black girls like? What kind of family did they come from? What could these albums tell us about Black girlhood in the second half of the 19th century? And what did Miranda and Sallie Venning know about their foremothers? And what opportunities were available to them in Philadelphia as the city industrialized? I had heard so often that sources do not exist to document the lives of Black girls during this period. However, I discovered a wealth of information. To reconstruct the Venning histories, I read census records, wills, and maps. I examined newspapers, letters, diaries, and annual reports of the Philadelphia School Board. I even studied cemetery records, archaeological reports, archival collection guides, and published primary sources. These sources documented the lives of 3 generations of Black girls in the Venning family: Sarah Martha, the enslaved grandmother, Julie Venning, the enslaved mother, and Miranda and Sallie Venning, born free in Philadelphia. The albums provide a lens into one Black family's history of imagining freedom in the 19th century. The taste for collecting autographs originated, many believe, in Germany in the 16th century. Albums were used to gather notes and correspond with colleagues. By the 18th century, Americans began the trend with their popularity at its peak during the Civil War. People signed albums during ceremonies like marriages and graduations with sentimental themes like the fragility of life or the sacredness of friendship. Despite their popularity, social anxieties surrounded the signing of autograph albums. Education, social status, and one's personality were at stake when signing an album. But most important, autograph collecting encouraged a girl's gradually increasing access to the public sphere. Signatures linked the private and the political and the individual and the community. And those at a loss of words quoted from well-known writers, as in this quoted passage from Ralph Waldo Emerson. The album's Materiality suggests that girls were encouraged to interact with others in public. Autograph albums are small and horizontal, often 7 by 5 inches or smaller. The album's paper, thick and durable, was constructed to withstand them being passed from one friend to the next. A cyclical relationship often existed, actually, between girls, paper, and autograph albums. The cycle begins with poor, lower-class women and girls working in the shadow economy of rag picking, and they sold these rags to paper mills. The paper mills cleaned and pressed the rags of cloth to make paper. The paper is manufactured to make blank books, such as autograph albums. The albums are then given as gifts to middle and upper-class girls. Therefore, girls of varying classes were central to the cyclical mechanisms of papermaking and book production in the 19th century. The Venning albums are 145 years old, yet the paper is not yellow or brittle, as is typical of paper made from wood pulp when it ages. The Venning albums are likely made with wove paper, a paper-making technique invented by James Watman, born in Kent, England. Noted for its exceptional quality, wove paper contains fibers woven to create a strong, rigid grid. Used for high-quality art and printing, wove paper was soon referred to as Watman paper. An edition of Virgil's poetry was printed on Watman paper. Napoleon wrote his will on Watman paper. Queen Victoria wrote her personal correspondence on Watman paper. The writer William Blake published 4 of his books on Watman paper, and Miranda and Sallie Venning's autograph albums are likely made with Watman paper. Albums contained illustrations of flowers that were often painted or drawn on the page. These flowers served a pedagogical purpose. In The Art of Flower Painting in Watercolor, M. Thomas writes, quote, "Flower painting is a worthy occupation for the mind of taste. The efforts of the pencil have charms adapted to the hours of the youth, when every bloom conspires to wake the soul by tender strokes of art, to raise the genius and improve the heart." The signatures in the albums, often elegantly executed, were clearly the focus of the page. People upheld the polished graces of elegant handwriting, proper penmanship, and correct spelling. As Tamara Thornton argues, quote, "By the end of the 19th century, Americans perceived handwriting in a new light. It was not just the isolated genius that could claim a distinctive handwriting. Everyone could. The signature of a schoolmate was of equal interest to that of a prominent person or poet." So I have discussed the art of autograph collecting and the album's materiality. I now turn to my second important point. Although Miranda and Sallie Venning are raised in an elite Black family in Philadelphia, their albums provide a lens into their violent family history. Their story begins in 1815, when Miranda and Sallie's grandmother, Sarah Martha, was born a slave in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina. We know Sarah Martha's birth year because her age was recorded in the South Carolina death records published between 1821 and 1865. During Sarah Martha's first 12 years, she and her mother, Juno, and her grandmother, Sari, lived on a 500-acre plantation called Whitehall near the city of Charleston. Their owner, Sabina Hall, was a white woman, an elderly widow in poor health who was winding down after a long lifetime of slave ownership. In 1821, when Sabina Hall was 82, She sold Whitehall Plantation to her stepson, a Charleston physician named Anthony Toomer. There was an understanding that Sabina Hall would continue to live there until her death. That same year, in 1821, Sabina Hall made her will. Sarah Martha, who was 6 years old when Sabina Hall drew up her will, was Hall's favorite slave. This is evident in the language of the will. According to wills and probate records for Charleston, South Carolina between 1818 and 1826, Sabina Hall made a complex provision for Sarah Martha in her will that was designed to protect Sarah Martha until she reached the age of 21. Hall constructed an arrangement that was intended to give Sarah Martha a girlhood that was as close to freedom as possible. It was no longer possible for Sabina Hall to manumit her slaves. In 1820, the South Carolina legislature had passed a law that made it illegal for owners to emancipate slaves. So Sabina Hall stipulated that Toomer should hire out 5 other slaves and use their wages to support Sarah Martha until she turned 21. This was an unrealistic will that had no means of legal enforcement, but clearly Sabina Hall believed she had protected Sarah Martha, her favorite slave. Sabina Hall died on January 9th, 1827, at the age of 88. Thus, when Sarah Martha was 12 years old, her protected girlhood ended. All of Sabina Hall's slaves became part of Anthony Toomer's plantation empire of over 2,000 acres and joined the 122 slaves Toomer owned. Sarah Martha and her mother and her grandmother became plantation slaves. So according to archaeological records of plantations in South Carolina, by the 1820s, the price of cotton had plummeted, and South Carolina plantation owners were scrambling to find marketable products. Toomer's plantations had poor soil, and the saline content in the water was too high for profitable rice cultivation. South Carolina estate inventories and bills of sale from 1773 to 1843 reveal that Toomer frequently mortgaged land and slaves to meet his financial obligations. Conditions were likely harsh for Toomer slaves. We know from John Hope Franklin's book, Runaway Slaves, Rebels on the Plantation, that at least one young male slave who had belonged to Sabina Hall ran away in 1830. But another event happened in 1830. According to Toomer's financial records, in 1830, he began selling the slaves he had inherited from Sabina Hall. In February 1830, at age 15, Sarah Martha is sold to Richard Cogdell Sanders, a 43-year-old married bank clerk. Sarah Martha's girlhood was truly over. She was taken from her mother and grandmother and placed in his household in Charleston. Within 10 months of being sold, 15-year-old Sarah Martha was pregnant by Richard Sanders. Over the next 2 decades, Sarah Martha had 9 more children. Only 5 survived beyond infancy. Richard also had 2 children with his wife, Cecile. Therefore, according to census records, he set up Sarah Martha and his 5 remaining children in a house on Tradd Street in Charleston, which was a mixed neighborhood of whites, free blacks, and slaves. Richard Cogdell Sanders made no effort to conceal his second family. His brother lived just a few houses away from Sarah Martha and her children. Richard educated his children and filled Sarah Martha's house with the trappings of middle-class life: a set of fine china, a piano, and a machine for washing clothes. According to census records, a nurse named Clara also lived in the household and cared for the children. But whatever comforts and advantages Sarah Martha and her children had could not mitigate the reality that they were slaves who belonged to Richard Cogdell Sanders. If he had squandered his inheritance or gone into debt, the facade of freedom he had created would end, and he would have been forced to sell Sarah Martha and their children. So Sarah Martha died in 1850 at the age of 33 of puerperal fever days after giving birth to her 10th child. Puerperal fever is an infection of the uterus that develops within 3 days after childbirth and often led to septicemia in the 19th century. We know only a few details about Sarah Martha as a person. We know that she mourned the loss of her babies. I evaluated cemetery subscription records, which revealed that in 1843, Sarah Martha paid on time for a gravestone for one of her babies. When Sarah Martha died, the gravestone Richard Cogdell Sanders erected for her read, quote, "She was loved by all who knew her for her gentleness of character," end quote. Historian Amrita Myers sees Sarah Martha as a woman who, quote, "used savvy tactics of negotiation," end quote, to obtain advantages for her children. However, I view Sarah Martha as a person who was denied girlhood. Sarah Martha's story is a powerful illustration that good intentions by white owners counted little in a global economy in which human beings were property that were vulnerable to the fluctuations of the marketplace. So in 1850, the year Sarah Martha died, the U.S. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. With one stroke of the pen, the Sanders children became much more vulnerable. Robert, the oldest, had already acquired skill in tailoring, but white laborers were becoming increasingly resentful of their African American competitors. Sarah Martha's children were completely dependent on Richard Cogdell Sanders, their white father and owner, for food, clothing, shelter, and most important, protection from slave catchers. Also, Richard was getting old. An aging Richard realized that the false freedom he had created for his enslaved children were at risk. He could not free them. He could not even leave them property legally. Throughout the 1840s and 1850s, white hostility grew towards black people in Charleston. In 1846, South Carolina began to enforce a colonial-era law that required black people to wear badges when owners hired out their labor. And in 1857, there was even a rebellious talk in the state legislature of reopening the slave trade. So as the years passed and the national debate about slavery became more heated, the mood in Charleston became more volatile. The only way Richard could protect his children was to get them out of the South. Therefore, in 1858, Richard moved his 5 children from Charleston, South Carolina to Philadelphia. He bought them a 3-story brick house in the 3rd ward of the rapidly growing city. The address was 116 Fitzwater Street. Here is a picture of family members on the stoop. The racial composition of Fitzwater Street, derived from the U.S. federal census, reveals that the neighborhood was mostly white. An 1860 census record reveals Richard Cogdell Sanders also moved to Philadelphia. However, he lived in a hotel in the 8th ward called La Pierre House on the 100 block of South Broad Street. This migration from South Carolina to Philadelphia marks the 2nd generation of Sanders' children who were born in slavery but worked to find freedom in Philadelphia. Robert Sanders was 26, Julia was 23, Sarah Ann was 19, Cordelia was 17, and Sophia was 11. Robert, the oldest, became the head of the household and began running a tailoring business from home. The occupations of heads of households in the block surrounding 116 Fitzwater Street included grocer, superintendent, physician, merchant, and stove maker. However, Robert's occupation as a tailor provided employment for numerous family members for the rest of the century. So the Sanders siblings immediately made contact with elite free black people in Philadelphia. The earliest evidence of the Sanders siblings in Philadelphia is when Cordelia Sanders, age 17, and Sarah Ann Sanders, age 19, started visiting Charlotte Fortin at her home in March 1858. After one gathering, Charlotte Fortin, a native Philadelphian and prominent anti-slavery activist, wrote in her diary that she was very impressed with 17-year-old Cordelia's imagination. Quote, "A great deal of freshness and originality," she wrote in her journal. Fortin thought the entire Sanders family was, quote, "much more interesting than Southerners usually are," end quote. But the most revealing detail Fortin observed is that the Sanders siblings did not see themselves as slaves and did not understand their connection to the abolitionist movement. Fortin wrote that she would, quote, "try hard to convert them to anti-slavery," end quote. Perhaps in their minds, Sarah Martha's children were already free. So the next 15 years in Philadelphia were very eventful for the five Sanders siblings. Julia Sanders marries Edward Venning in 1861. Cordelia likely continued her education at the Institute for Colored Youth, which was just 6 blocks away from 116 Fitzwater. For most of the 1860s, she taught grades 4 through 6 in Colored School Number 1 in Brooklyn, New York. However, in 1865, the youngest sibling, Sophia Sanders, died at the age of 18. The next year, in 1866, Richard Cogdell Sanders, their white father, died. He had managed to live long enough to protect his children until they were free. In 1870, Cordelia married William Chew and had 2 children. But the next year, another sibling, Sarah Ann Sanders, died at the age of 31. So by 1871, only 3 of the 10 children Sarah Martha had were left: Robert, Julia, and Cordelia. They took advantage of every resource their wealthy white father could provide. By the time their father, Richard Cogdell, moved them to Philadelphia in 1858, they were ready to join the city's elite circle of mixed-race community leaders. When Julia Sanders married Edward Venning, they had 5 children. Miranda Venning is in the center, and Sallie Venning is the youngest. I now turn to the final section of my lecture. I examine the signatures inside the Venning autograph albums. Signatures reveal that the Venning sisters fostered friendships and secured networks. Through grit and determination, Miranda and Sallie knew they had to find a way or make one. We began in the year 1875 when Miranda Venning was 13. Her parents sent her to Cambridge, Massachusetts to attend the predominantly white Washington Grammar School for 2 years. Miranda lives with Eleanor Jacobs, sister-in-law to Harriet Jacobs, author of the slave narrative, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. In 1875, Eleanor Jacobs lost her husband, John Jacobs, who was Harriet Jacobs' brother. The Venning family knew Eleanor, Harriet, and Louisa Jacobs, who were running boarding houses in Cambridge. On May 7, 1877, when Miranda is 15, her uncle gives her an autograph book. On July 2, 1877, Miranda collects Harriet and Louisa Jacobs' signatures. Louisa writes, quote, "Precept is good, but example is better. A precept is a principle, often with some religious basis that dictates how one should act or behave. Louisa encourages Miranda to make her own choices rather than follow empty maxims about morality. As Harriet Jacobs considered what to write in the album of the 15-year-old black girl she had befriended, Jacobs likely cast her mind back to 1828, when she herself was 15. That year, Harriet Jacobs was trying to avoid the sexual advances of her owner, who refused to leave her alone. Jacobs writes about this difficult decision in her slave narrative, quote, "I was struggling alone in the powerful grasp of the demon slavery," she wrote. "I was a poor slave girl, only 15 years old," end quote. Harriet Jacobs must have felt satisfaction and pleasure to see 15-year-old Miranda preparing for a future by developing her intellectual capacities instead of trying to stop a sexual predator or manage pregnancy and childbirth against her will. Jacobs writes in Miranda's album, quote, "Trust and be hopeful." Should I get rid of that thing? Let me try to get rid of that. Okay. Oh. Okay. Surely, Jacobs writes in Miranda's album, quote, "Trust and be hopeful." This message from Jacobs to a 15-year-old black girl has profound implications. Surely, Miranda had read incidents in the life of a slave girl and had thought of her own grandmother, who had faced the same situation as Jacobs at the age of 15. And surely, Miranda must have been mindful of the many contrasts between her girlhood and the girlhoods of her grandmother, Sarah Martha, and Harriet Jacobs. The calculations and choices Miranda was making were so different from the ones her grandmother and Jacobs had been forced to make. So when Harriet wrote of being hopeful in Miranda's albums, she was transmitting the power of black women's persistence and determination to young Miranda Venning. So Jacobs' 1877 autograph reinforces ideals of independence and freedom. 2 decades earlier, Julia Griffith edited the 1853 volume Autographs for Freedom, an anti-slavery initiative sponsored by the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society. In the 1853 edition, Frederick Douglass publishes his short story, The Heroic Slave, and includes his autograph at the bottom. For fugitive slaves like Harriet Jacobs and Frederick Douglass, the autograph establishes literacy, lineage, and legacy, all of which were prohibited under the institution of slavery. Therefore, an autograph stands in direct opposition to the tenets of slavery. By signing their names, Douglass and Jacobs claim ownership of themselves. So Miranda fulfilled her mentor's expectations. She was the first black graduate of the Normal School for Girls in 1882. I examined her scrapbook, which indicates she became a teacher in Philadelphia in 1883. Miranda was also an accomplished musician. Beginning at age 19, Miranda performed piano solos and recitals throughout Philadelphia. However, Miranda ends her career as the principal of the Joseph E. Hill School until her death in the year 1900. She was only 38 years old. So when the Vennings sent Miranda to Cambridge in 1875, Edward Venning, the father, was earning an income as a carpenter. However, he dies of consumption in 1884. This death affected the family's financial stability and young Sallie Venning's educational future. Sallie Venning was born in 1872, sorry. Her autograph album of signatures that began in 1886 commemorates the end of her education in the 8th grade. By linking the names of classmates who signed Sallie's autograph album in 1886 with the 1880 census record, I determined that at least 35% of the people who signed her album were white, mostly the children of immigrants. The content of their inscriptions indicate that Sallie was truly friendly with them. One classmate, Maggie Morrison, wrote, quote, Remember me in friendship, remember me in love. Remember me, dear Sallie, when we meet above. On March 31st, 1886, schoolmate Alice McCluskey writes, quote, "When the golden sun is setting and your heart from care is free, when of others you are thinking, will you sometimes think of me?" Another classmate writes, quote, "What is home without its joys? What are the girls without the boys?" Another classmate, Stella, writes, quote, "When you are old and cannot see, put on your specs and think of me." And there is a familiar poem, quote, "Roses are red, violets blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you." These sentiments may have been inspired by popular manuals such as the 1850 text, "The American Lady's Memorial, an indispensable home book for the wife, mother, daughter." Proper selections for albums include themes of hope, friendship, and love. Some classmates drew lines on the page to ensure a neat handwriting. This practice references 19th century copybooks and handwriting practice sheets. In the 18th century, Black students in the Clarkson Institute, a school sponsored by the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society, used practice sheets with moral watchwords. So on February 22nd, 1798, one student in the Clarkson Institute, his name is Lewis Caleb, he wrote, quote, "Delight in virtue." In 1792, Charles Bustill, father to the writer Gertrude Bustill Moselle, wrote, quote, "Avoid bad habits." The Venning albums contribute to a tradition of Black handwriting practices. When the Black engraver Scipio Moorhead writes, when the Black engraver Scipio Moorhead creates the frontispiece to Phyllis Wheatley's 1773 collection, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, he likely referenced George Bickman's 1743 text, The Universal Penman. However, Wheatley's poised posture, perfect positioning of quill in hand and paper on desk anticipates future handwriting manuals. Published in his 1819 manual, A New and Easy Introduction to the Art of Penmanship, James Carver writes, quote, "Let the forefinger lie directly on the back part of the pen. Let the third and fourth fingers be bent naturally under toward the hollow of the hand. Let the paper be placed squarely in front of the writing desk. Let the right arm lay easy and light upon the desk," end quote. So after graduation, Sallie continued to live at 116 Fitzwater. As her diary entries from 1890 to 1892 indicate, Sallie taught school when Miranda was sick. She attended church and worked in the family tailoring business. Diary entries also indicate she had a robust social life. Sallie played cards, she went to the beach, and she went to the theater. Here is a picture of Sallie and her friends sitting leisurely on a hammock in the yard of her home at 116 Fitzwater. At age 31, Sallie marries William B. Holden in 1903, and here is their marriage announcement. Census records indicate that Sallie worked as a dressmaker and a homemaker. So during Sallie and Miranda's girlhoods, the economic opportunities available to Black people in Philadelphia shrank. The hope that Miranda's mentor, Harriet Jacobs, spoke of in the 1870s was not realized. According to the special report on occupation for the 1904 census, published by the Department of Commerce and Labor, by 1890, only 9.7% of Black men and 6.4% of Black women had jobs in manufacturing. The vast majority of the city's Black women, 91.6% worked in domestic and personal service. 22.1% of Black men worked in transportation as porters on railways. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the first scholars to note that the Industrial Revolution did not benefit Black people in Philadelphia. He wrote in 1899 that, quote, most people in Philadelphia were willing and many eager that Negroes should be kept as menial servants rather than develop into industrial factors, end quote. The Sanders-Venning family protected their daughters from the harsh economic reality that developed in the 1880s for Black people in Philadelphia. They also chose occupations that were secure and did not depend on the goodwill of a white employer. Because Miranda received the best education a Philadelphia teacher could have, she earned a good income in the 1890s. According to the Philadelphia's 1892 annual report of the Board of Public Education, Miranda, who was principal of the Joseph E. Hill Secondary School, was earning a salary of $750 per year. That was the equivalent of $20,800 in 2017. Partially because of Miranda's income and partially because of Robert Sanders' wise choice to operate a home tailoring business, Sallie Venning was able to stay at home and delay marriage until she felt ready. Finally, they lived as an extended family at 116 Fitzwater for many decades and thus were able to pool financial resources and childcare. When spouses died, other families could help a widower raise their children and provide a stable home base. To make the histories of Black girlhood visible and accessible, I developed a digital humanities project titled Digital Girls, Mapping Black Girlhood in the 19th Century. Geographic Information System, GIS technology, is a computer mapping system designed to capture and display coordinates and data related to positions on Earth's surface. Digital Girls uses GIS mapping technology to create a 3D digital map that documents the cultural activities of Black girls living in Philadelphia during the first 2 decades of freedom. I used Google Sheets to organize research into rubrics such as date, time, location, and venue of cultural activities. Red stars on the digital map reveals the distance between locations to convey how Black girls found freedom through their movement, independence, and network building practices. For example, one click shows information on Miranda's performance at the musical hall. Another click on the map shows the actual building where she performed. The Vennings performed in the Natatorium Hall in Philadelphia, and here is a picture of the actual building that still stands in Philadelphia. Miranda Venning attended the Institute for Colored Youth, and another click on the map offers information on the actual institute. Translating my archival research on 19th century Black girlhoods onto a digital platform centers Black girls in digital humanities research. Digital Girls brings rare archival materials to life and makes the histories of Black girls relevant and visible. We must explore under-examined print and material sources that teach us about the history of Black girls. The Venning albums review evidence of intimate relationships between girls. Each individual touched the album, flipped through its pages, read messages from others, and decided carefully on their own inscription. Thus, the albums help us think in recuperative, productive ways about touch and intimacy in the 1880s that move beyond associations of touch with sexualized violence in the antebellum era. The autograph albums teach us about Black girls' networks and alliances, The albums show us that placing Black girlhood at the center of our research opens new realms of analysis and alternative methodologies. And finally, my research on Black girlhood uncovers the history of their lives from the archives. Thank you.